He was the most traveled and the most televised pope in history, spreading his message to his flock of Catholics and to the rest of the world as well. At 58, he was the youngest pontiff in more than a century, and the first non-Italian elected to the papacy in almost 500 years. His surprise election came in October of 1978, when his predecessor, John Paul I, died suddenly after a brief reign of only 33 days. Then, with the Vatican conclave deadlocked over 2 Italian candidates, they turned to a little-known cardinal from Krakow. Almost immediately, John Paul II, as he was known, defined his public style: open, smiling, and moving easily with the common people. This modern pope skillfully used live television to spread the pictures of his travels around the world. He was a man of exceptional vigor, an avid skier, mountain climber, and swimmer, quickly earned the name God's athlete. Before becoming a priest, Karol Wojtyła had been a factory worker, actor, and playwright. But above all, he was a Pole, a nationalist who survived the brutal Nazi occupation of Poland and who stood up to communism. As God's politician, John Paul II had no doubt about his mission. The Pope, he said, must be a moral force. He wasted no time in using the moral authority of the Church to strike a blow against communism. On the Pope's 1979 trip to Poland, an estimated 10 million Poles, 1/3 of the nation's population, turned out to see the pontiff. His public challenge to the repressive Soviet regime encouraged a small workers' union to become a nationwide movement for freedom called Solidarity. Then, in May 1981, as John Paul II toured St. Peter's Square, a gunman fired a volley of shots. The Pope suffered such serious stomach wounds he was given the last rites, but within weeks he was on his feet again. Later, John Paul II would go to the prison and personally forgive the man who tried to kill him, whose suspected ties to the Bulgarian secret police and the Soviet KGB were never proven. In December 1989, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev came to Rome at the Pope's invitation. This historic meeting ended 70 years of suspended diplomatic ties between Moscow and the Holy See. The Cuban dictator Fidel Castro would also visit the Vatican and pave the way for a papal trip to Cuba in 1998. In the presence of dictators, John Paul spoke out against oppression and injustice. But in the West, he warned against the excesses of materialism. According to church teachings, helping the poor is a moral responsibility. But in Latin America, John Paul was firm on the separation of religion and politics. In Nicaragua, he ordered priests to leave the Sandinista government. There would be no place for liberation theology in this Pope's doctrine. John Paul II made several pilgrimages to the United States. His papacy spanned the terms of 5 U.S. presidents, from Jimmy Carter to George W. Bush. With Ronald Reagan, he shared a passion for ridding Eastern Europe of communism and for bringing morally conservative values to young people. In 1987, thousands of adolescents turned out to see him on his visit to Los Angeles, where he was accorded the kind of reception usually reserved for rock stars. And in New York, he turned Central Park into a giant outdoor mass.
God bless America.
Everywhere he went, greeting crowds from his Pope-mobile, the faithful were ecstatic.
Feliz Navidad.
Fluent in 8 languages, the Pope often addressed his flock in their mother tongue, and the faithful forgave him when he erred.
Ensimismamiento. Ensimismamiento.
The Pope was certainly no traditionalist when it came to spreading the Church's message across the world. Crisscrossing 6 continents, more than 130 countries, his air miles equaled more than 28 trips around the earth. Yet while Pope John Paul II brought the papacy into the modern era, he never wavered from strict interpretation of church doctrine. He successfully withstood challenges to liberalize church practice on divorce, homosexuality, the ordination of women, the marriage of priests, birth control, and abortion.
The Catholic Church is unambiguously committed to protecting and cherishing every human life, including the life of the unborn.
By the spring of 2002, the Catholic Church in America had become embroiled in scandal and crisis. Charges of the sexual abuse of minors by priests and cover-ups by the church hierarchy led the Pope to summon the American cardinals to the Vatican. John Paul said that abuse was both a crime and a sin. The Pope also made the Church more reflective of the changing demographics of its membership, appointing Catholics from Latin America, Africa, and Asia to Vatican posts. In the year 2000, he set out on an important pilgrimage to the Holy Land and left a written apology for the wrongs of Christians against the Jews. But as he grew older, he weakened. He had several operations and suffered from Parkinson's disease. When walking proved too difficult, he was pushed along on a moving platform. With all that he accomplished, John Paul II was happiest in his role of simple priest, as shepherd to his flock, watching over the faithful and bringing them the assurance of his message, "Be not afraid." In the course of his papacy, the world changed dramatically, but not the inner convictions of John Paul II, nor his vision of just what the Church stands for.
Well, that was a solid review of the life of John Paul II, who died here in Rome within a block or two of where I'm sitting right now at 9:37 Roman time. It's now 9 in the morning here in Rome. It's cold. As you can see, I've gotten an overcoat. I went from the regular suit to the sweater to the overcoat as it's gotten closer to dawn here. The crowds which surrounded this, the papacy here in St. Peter's Square, of course, are still there. The traffic is finally slowed down. We've been hearing all night from different versions of the truth here. I mean that quite seriously. There's so many aspects of the Catholic religion, so much social philosophy, theology involved in it, so much change in the world in the last 30 years, so much argument, so much ferment, and so much good work, of course, in the decline of the communist world, the final defeat of it, largely because of the spiritual inspiration of the man who just passed away last night here, the decline of the dropping of the Iron Curtain, the opening of the Berlin Wall, all to some extent because of the spiritual urgency of giving men and women their freedom to express themselves religiously and intellectually, as well as being free people in this world. John Paul II was responsible for a lot of that fervor in the 1970s and 1980s. Of course, coming to this city, it's amazing to see this city. It's thousands of years old. You're confronted as you come in with the eternity of the eternal city, as well as the zest of this city. People on mopeds driving past the Colosseum. You don't need more than that to visualize this city tonight as it honors the passing of another pope, one of the big ones, John Paul II, certainly a man of history, if not a man who made a lot of history. We'll be right back with more of our coverage of the legacy of John Paul II right after this.
People's desire for freedom, for religious freedom, for human rights. The Pope has been a stalwart. And if you look at what happened in 1989 and 1990 and 1991, you cannot but help recognize the tremendous contribution of Pope John Paul II.
Now 6 hours and 15 minutes since the announcement from the Vatican that Pope John Paul II had died. It is unlikely that we are telling you that news for the first time today. It is certain that it has gone across the world in that ensuing time, if not much quicker than that. But let's recap briefly some of the details that we know of as to what happens now. We feel like orphans this evening. Those are the words of Archbishop Sandri to 70,000 who packed St. Peter's Square, who were in the midst of prayers for the Pope when the announcement of his death after 2 months of illness and 3 days of acute illness was announced. He will lie in state at the Basilica. That will begin no earlier than late Monday, according to the reports from the Vatican, and the funeral mass and the burial will take place 4 to 6 days from the day of the death. Perhaps it will be in St. Peter's. There is no indication yet of what the Pope left in terms of instructions as to the location of his burial. A great number of the popes, nearly 200 of them, are buried there, but not all of them are, and this one may not be. He may be buried in his native Poland. Cardinals have been summoned to Rome, where they will meet for the first time, not yet in conclave, but merely procedurally, sometime on Monday. When they get to the conclave, which could open as early as Sunday, April 17th, or perhaps as late as Friday, April 22nd, there are about 117 of the cardinals who will be voting on the next pope. Only 3 of them have ever cast a vote for pope before. In the hours after the death of the 3rd longest serving pope, it is hard to conceive that this is true, but the arduous 26 years and 4 months of his pontificate might not have been the most challenging of Karol Wojtyła's life. Certainly not the most physically challenging. We know of how he survived an assassination, how he survived tumors and fractures and Parkinson's, how he survived all the blights of old age. But in knowing that, we know only the surface of the story of 84 years of near physical indomitability. The 3rd longest serving pope became such in part because he was elected at age 58, making him the youngest pope since Pius IV in 1846. But moreover, this is a man who seems to have cheated death with remarkable regularity over the course of his 84 years. That Karol Wojtyła survived his childhood and early adulthood alone might be called something of a miracle. His first near-death experience in Poland came at the age of 10. The boy was playing with a friend who had borrowed his father's rifle, assuming it was not loaded. Jokingly, that friend turned the gun on Karol. It was loaded. The bullet whizzed past Wojtyła's face, missing him by just inches. He might later have seen that as an omen. When the Nazis invaded Krakow in 1939, Karol and his father tried to escape. They were stopped by low-flying German planes, strafing the fleeing refugees with machine gun fire. The future pope would be pressed into forced labor at a plant in Solvay, another silver lining as it proved. The work was dangerous. He once witnessed the death of the laborer next to him in an accident. But in 1941, when he was arrested in a Nazi roundup, that worker card he had kept him from being sent to Auschwitz. Karol Wojtyła instead spent that time in an underground seminary studying for the priesthood in secrecy. Later, in 1943, he was hit by a German truck. That sped off. It left him comatose. Had a woman not found him and called for help, he surely would have died in the street. He woke up in the hospital with severe concussion, covered in bandages, but alive. On August 6, 1944, a week after the uprising in Warsaw, the Nazis began arresting every male adult in Krakow in hopes of preventing another revolt. But Karol Wojtyła was spending that day praying in his basement apartment, listening to the sound of the Nazis' boots on the floorboards above him. The noise finally died away. The stormtroopers had not thought to check the basement. The following morning, a messenger came for Karol, ferried him away to the secret seminary. After that, his name appeared on a Nazi blacklist. Gunshots, speeding automobiles, political maelstroms, facets of his childhood and youth that would seemingly coalesce 37 years later. May 13, 1981, 5:19 p.m. Karol Wojtyła, now Pope John Paul II, circling St. Peter's Square in his Jeep, better known as the Pope-mobile, before his Wednesday general audience. Turkish terrorist Mehmet Ali Aka fires at the Pope, wounding him in the hand and in the abdomen. He is whisked to Gemelli Hospital, spends 6 hours in surgery, 22 days in hospital. 2 weeks after he was released, an infection developed. The Pope had to return to Gemelli for a second operation, nearly 3 months more of recuperation. All told, he would spend 78 days there and return in July 1992. That's when the Pope had a tumor removed from his gallbladder. The scheduled surgery turned out to be just in time. Doctors would say later that tumor was the size of an orange and turning malignant. They were forced to also remove the gallbladder itself. 1992 was also the first year that traces of Parkinson's disease started to become evident in the Pope, though the Vatican would deny that disease truth long past the time anyone else had any doubt. As it advanced, the complications increased. November 1993, John Paul fell down some steps at the Vatican, dislocating his right shoulder. He underwent surgery and spent the night at Gemelli. Upon his release, he would say, "The Pope salutes you. It's a slightly deficient Pope, but still in one piece and not dead yet." In April of '94, he falls again, fractures his femur, requires hip replacement surgery. In October 1996, the Pope's appendix is removed, and he spends another week at Gemelli Hospital. And in June of 1999, the Pope fell again in the papal residence in Warsaw. He cut his right temple. 3 days later in Krakow, he came down with a fever and had to postpone his appearances there. As the Parkinson's progressed, the Vatican's silence about it continued. It was not until May of 2003, over a decade since the disease had first taken on its visible signs, that a Vatican official publicly acknowledged that the Pope did indeed have the disease. None of this slowed Pope John Paul II down for long. Over the course of his papacy, he set foot in more than 120 countries, at every continent save Antarctica. For years, he would kiss the ground upon arrival at every stop. When he became too frail to do that, he insisted instead that a bowl of soil be brought to his lips. 2 months ago, of course, the Pope went into the hospital with the flu and severe breathing problems. We were told then it was the end. It was not. Just as yesterday afternoon at 1:30 Eastern Time, foreign news agencies and an American cable news channel had reported the Pope had died. He had not. And when the morning papers hit Italian newsstands, the headlines emblazoned across the front of the daily La Stampa prematurely read, "John Paul II, 1978 to 2005. The headline would prove true eventually, but not until 9:37 p.m. that night in Rome, 2:37 p.m. the following day in America. One final triumph, one last wry smile or gentle laugh for the Pope, if only in our imaginations, a laugh or smile in triumph over death. I'm joined now again by Carl Bernstein, the author of His Holiness John Paul II and the Hidden History of Our Time, who has been with us the last few nights discussing those topics. Good evening again, Carl.
Good evening.
The physical suffering of this man inexorably intertwined with his vision of his religion, correct?
Well, the suffering of Christ is the basis of an awful lot of Catholicism. And he is a mystic, and his mystical belief is tied to Christ's suffering. He studied under a mystic named Jan Tyranowski in a group of young men who called themselves the Living Rosary, and they were greatly influenced by St. John of the Cross, a mystic who believed that the heart of Christian life was in suffering, and that to know Christ was to endure suffering and to emulate his suffering. And I think at the end of his life, I think the end of his pontificate itself really let us see both the man and put his pontificate into great perspective for us, because I think that finally we could see how it really was all based, including the geopolitical genius, on his theology, on his belief, on his understanding of Christ's teachings. And watching the discussions on this air tonight, I was particularly struck again by the contradictions in Karol Wojtyla, which many people have remarked on over the year, but how in the end his papacy is so defined by some of those contradictions in that he perfected a philosophy of the human person that recognized human rights, that appealed to his great sense of social justice, to the great tradition of social justice in the Catholic Church that goes all the way back to its origins in the teachings of Christ. And yet, at the same time, as this theologian you were talking to a little while ago indicated, that what is emphasized in theology at a given moment defines what a church or a religion is about. And at this time, part of his theology clearly was at odds with the beliefs of many of the people in his own church and outside that church, and it particularly is true in things having to do with gender, with women, with sexuality, and a church that is run exclusively by men. I think that really comes through at the end of his papacy, and it's so interesting because of his own personal story. It's so tied up with Marianism, it's so tied up with his views of women in some ways, and you go back to his seamless philosophy of life beginning at conception and protection of the unborn, and you think of the experience of his own mother as he has told the story. His understanding was that when his older brother was born, his mother was told that if she conceived again, she would probably not live through the experience and might not be able to deliver the child. That child, of course, who was conceived was Karol Wojtyla, and she died when he was 9 years old. That event obviously had a great effect upon him. How it has affected his theology, we don't know. But it's very hard to separate people from their past, from the experiences of their lives, even popes. And we see in the end of his pontificate all of the greatness, all of the great commitment to ideals of serving those who do not have the luxuries that the few have, whether those luxuries be economic, whether they be social. His commitment was to those who did not have a life of ease, who indeed had to suffer, who were marginalized by disease, or marginalized by race, or marginalized by economic hardship, etc., etc. And yet there are others who are marginalized by questions of sex and questions of gender. And it seems to me that the next Pope of the Catholic Church in some way is either going to have to deal with some of those contradictions because they do involve the perennial theology, and this Pope believed that the perennial theology had an answer for everything without the perennial theology evolving or being changed. And the question is, will the next Pope do that? Or as the theologian that we heard from a few minutes ago said, it depends on what you emphasize, what the Church chooses to emphasize, what the Pope chooses to emphasize. And it's going to be very interesting to see who is elected Pope. And we won't know for a while after he's begun his papacy how he's going to handle these contradictions that he has been left by this greatest of modern popes. And one last thought about this papacy is how it's bracketed with another great papacy, that of John the 23rd, from which the name John Paul is partly taken. Remarkable that we've had two great popes in less than half a century. And in many regards, this papacy was a restraint on some of the forces let loose by John the 23rd's convening of the Vatican Council and areas of theology that this Pope, John Paul, thought had gone too far. But his greatness, absolutely unmistakable, and he's going to be remembered as a great figure in our history.
Carl Bernstein, the author of His Holiness, John Paul II, and the Hidden History of Our Time. I think for the last time tonight, at least, our great thanks.
Good to be here.
Of course, when you think of the Pope and women and mysticism, his own youth was influenced significantly by a woman called Sister Faustina, a Polish mystic who had suggested a renewal of Catholic devotion to God's mercy through a date, an event called Divine Mercy Sunday, which was designated as April 2nd. That might tell you, so they're April 3rd, forgive me, the last day of the Easter celebration, which would be the day after this Pope who followed so much of Sister Faustina's teachings and supported her causes, passed away. Coming up, as our coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II continues inside the conclave that will select his successor. You are watching MSNBC.
Neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor death, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God.
Welcome back to our MSNBC coverage of the passing of John Paul II. It was 9 o'clock, 9:37, actually Roman time. It's now 4-something in the morning here. It's cold, as I've said before. You know, even now, our MSNBC being something of a political channel, we're thinking about what's coming next. And of course, we're going to dwell a lot more on the life of John Paul II in the days between now and his funeral in 4 or 5 days. But we all have obviously a lot of, you know, honest, what's the right word, curiosity about what might come next in the wake of this wonderful papacy. Let's take a look now at a Keith Miller package. This is a look at how the next pope is going to be picked.
Nearly 150 cardinals from more than 50 countries must make their way to Rome for the funeral of Pope John Paul II and the election of his successor. The Vatican is now being run by the Sacred College of Cardinals. This elite group within the Church will preside over the funeral of the Pope.
Among the first matters that must be decided, they cannot delay on this, is when will the funeral take place? And according to the rules at the moment, the funeral should take place between the 4th and the 6th day after the demise of the Pope.
In a tradition dating to the 13th century, the cardinals will go into conclave, the process of electing a new pope. Conclave is a Latin word meaning locked up, and that's exactly what will happen here in the Vatican. The cardinals will be locked up. No television, no newspapers, no contact with the outside world that could influence their decision. It's a lot like a major American trial where the jury is sequestered or locked up until it can reach a decision. The original idea was not to keep the public out, but to force the cardinals to make a decision.
The notion of conclave came about actually because they were taking too long about it, and somebody eventually locked them in a palace and told them to get on with it, and they wouldn't let them out until they'd done it.
Today it's not a palace but an apartment complex where the cardinals will be sequestered. Each day they have a short drive to the Sistine Chapel to cast their ballots for the next pope. It is a magnificent setting for an occasion of high drama. The walls display the history of mankind, a project that took the masters of Italian Renaissance painting 50 years to complete. The cardinals cast their ballots beneath Michelangelo's creation, and the backdrop to electing a new pope, the majestic fresco of the Last Judgment. Each day there will be a security sweep, the chapel checked for electronic bugs. The cardinals are sworn to secrecy.
I think secrecy helps people to be freer. That, of course, the cardinals talk with one another. I mean, they're talking with one another constantly. So that there's a lot of confidence and toing and froing between the cardinals.
120 cardinals can take part in the conclave, but cardinals over the age of 80 are not allowed to vote. A 2/3 majority is needed to elect a pope, but in the unlikely case of a deadlock, the cardinals can agree to elect by an absolute majority plus one. The world learns that a new pope has been elected by a smoke signal from the Sistine Chapel. All inconclusive ballots are burned with a chemical to produce black smoke.
It's when the white smoke comes out that the crowds then realize, aha, the election has taken place. Any minute now, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, they'll give the announcement. And that's very, very exciting.
Each conclave signals a new beginning for the church. In its 2,000-year history, there have been 264 successors to St. Peter. Today, the throne of the Holy See is vacant, awaiting the 265th Supreme Pontiff. Keith Miller, NBC News, the Vatican.
That was Keith Miller's great package. Did anybody say elections, politics, cigars in the back room? Let's talk to Monsignor Thomas McSweeney, an expert and an analyst for MSNBC and NBC. Monsignor, I read, I guess it was in John Allen's book on conclave, that although there are there's scores of cardinals who are under the age of 80 who can vote in this, that it really comes down to 3 or 4 guys in the back room with a couple glasses of wine and cigars, and they basically throw their weight back and forth and cut a deal.
I don't think so, not now, Chris. You know, in 1996, John Paul II created a whole new set of rules and regulations on the conclave, particularly the area of secrecy, absolute secrecy. In previous conclaves, people were bringing in tape recorders, they were taking notes and so forth, not allowed. This thing is going to be under the veil of complete secrecy, and that does give, as was pointed out in that package, the fellows a kind of freedom to speak without any repercussions afterwards. And some of the other changes in there also kind of indicate that indeed there is a democracy. Maybe this is the one moment every time we elect a pope that there is a little hint of democracy here, in that there's a 2/3 vote that is taken, or that the winner has to have 2/3 of the majority. But after 12 days and approximately 30 ballots, if they haven't gotten that 2/3 majority, they flip into then a simple majority +1. And that's going to be very interesting, too, to see how that unfolds. It's a way to hurry the process. And indeed, they will talk to one another. They will spend time. These cardinals have come to know each other over a certain period of time. They've read each other's documents. They know the problems that's going in the various dioceses. The Holy Father has created all kinds of opportunities over the years for these cardinals to come to know one another. They are under the obligation not to talk about candidacy and so forth until they actually get into the conclave. That's another form of constraint that's been placed on them.
What is the dynamic, though, to use a political term? Are there people who feel that the third world needs to be addressed more in terms of economics, in terms of debt, in terms of issues like World Bank, the whole economic redistribution question, the responsibilities of the first world to the third? Are there concerns that Europe may want to hold on to the papacy, that the Western Hemisphere would like to have a Latin American pope? What are the forces?
I think all of the above. I think if we look at the dynamic, well, first of all, let's look at the fact that the majority of these fellows have all been put into office by John Paul II. Earlier we were talking about some of the contradictions that might exist, you know, ideologically, dogmatically, and so forth. There's little of that going to go on here. The mindset of John Paul II has been fairly much embedded in each one of these, the minds and hearts and souls, dare I say, of each one of these guys. I think where the accommodation is going to have to come is out of the sheer dynamic of how many members of the College of Cardinals are from developing or third world nations, and more than half are from developing nations, and that will be a force, a dynamic that will have to be dealt with.
How about the standard that Pope John Paul II set? His linguistic ability, he was also had the gift of tongues almost, and being able to speak all the Romance languages, English, in addition to those, the Slavic languages. Nobody can match that, can they?
Well, that's one characteristic I doubt very much that anybody can really match. Of course, we've learned from, of course, all the packages that we've been watching here for the past couple of hours that John Paul II was a master dialectician when he was 9, 10 years old, doing Homer and doing dialectic studies. I mean, this was a sheer gift that he had. I think we look for different gifts in different people, but there's one characteristic, Chris, that I feel that that we're not going to be able to go back on. In other words, that the new fellow, the new pope, is going to have to live up to that characteristic of being an apostle in a modern world, the way John Paul II was. We can't go back to a pope that's caged in a bureaucratic shell in any way. Our pope, who has just gone on to his eternal reward, broke that shell, set up an efficient organizational center at the Vatican to deal with the day-to-day operations such as they are. But then he moved out. John Paul II moved out of that and went traveling, used the media terribly effectively, and became a presence that caused the Pope now to become a global leader and a moral conscience. And to sustain that characteristic, the electors are going to have to look for somebody that can match that.
I love looking for American parallels because our audience is American, people watching right now. You know how when the Republican Party a couple of years ago decided they wanted a very young Associate Justice for the Supreme Court, someone who had been there a long time, so they picked Clarence Thomas. I've heard in the last couple of hours or today sometime that the Pope, the college may feel that they don't want a Pope who's going to come in and say his early 50s and serve for maybe 30 years. They're worried about that. They'd rather go to maybe even do a Ratzinger, someone who's older who won't really be that big an investment.
Well, now we're getting down to looking at the front runners and so forth, and quite frankly, Chris, you know, after 2,000 years, maybe 2 or 3 popes were actually predicted before they went into a conclave, and that should be a good lesson for us
I meant
here.
the issue of, no, I'm just, do you think, have you heard any sentiment that there's a fear of picking someone who's really young and have to start another huge era again?
No, I have not heard that at all. No. I think what I have heard is that there's an openness to the Spirit. This may sound a little mystical, but all of them go in and they stand there before God and each other and they say, I will make my decision based on the best that I can as a human being, but I pray that the Holy Spirit will touch me in this enterprise. And they really believe
Do you believe in the pendulum? Last question, you believe in the pendulum, that the sense that one, like we have in American politics, where you get an old Eisenhower, you get a young Kennedy, you get a soft Carter, you get a tough Reagan, you get a guy a little messed up on the moral side, Clinton, so you bring in a clean as a whistle, good married guy like Bush. Did the College of Cardinal try to fix a current problem with a new man?
Well, I don't know what they would view a current problem being, quite frankly. They believe that the Pope has spoken unambiguously, created documents that are unambiguous about the direction that he set, and that vision, I again say, is clearly embedded in each one of these guys.
So no big change?
I don't think so.
Okay, I got something out of you. Monsignor McSweeney.
Thanks, Chris.
That's my job. No big changes, McSweeney. Okay, thank you, Monsignor, very much for ending our coverage tonight. Thank you, sir, for coming on, Reverend. We'll be right back. Let's go to Keith right now. We'll be coming right back in a moment with more of our coverage all over the place as we get into the evening here, late into the evening. I'm right in front of the Sistine Chapel still. It's almost dawn here in Rome. An amazing bit of history. A page is being turned. The death of John Paul II. We'll be right back.
With his visit to Auschwitz in 1979, John Paul II became the first pope to visit the site of a concentration camp. His prayers for Holocaust victims and heartfelt blessing of the site marked the beginning of a strong new relationship with the Jewish community that would continue throughout his papacy.
Habemus Papam.
Habemus Papam, we have a pope.
He is the first non-Italian pope in 455 years.
Karl Wojtyła returned to his homeland as Pope John Paul II.
The first papal visit to a communist country was political as well as personal. Thousands of Poles shouting solidarity as they left a mass with Pope John Paul in Warsaw tonight.
Pope John Paul II today issued a challenge to the communist government there.
If the Russians were to invade Poland in an effort to suppress solidarity, the Pope said that he would return to Poland and stand shoulder to shoulder with his people.
The Kremlin was terrified by this Pope. Reagan thought this Pope would change the world.
We join with the Holy See in our concern for a world of peace.
It is election day in Poland, and what makes it special is that for the first time it offers a real choice.
Gorbachev announced the Soviets have changed their attitude towards religion.
Violence is evil. That violence is unacceptable.
This is an NBC News special report.
Pope John Paul II was shot and wounded as he rode in the back of an open-topped Jeep to his weekly audience in St. Peter's.
The Pope had just opened his general audience, blessing a young girl and waving to the faithful. Then, suddenly, a hand, a gun, and a volley of fire.
He was taken into the operating room for hours of intense surgery. He was quoted as saying, "How could they have done this to me?"
Pope John Paul met today with the man who tried to assassinate him 2.5 years ago and called him brother.
Paul II has touched down in more than 120 countries.
The most widely traveled Pope the world has ever known.
He has blessed more people than his 263 predecessors combined.
Many of these Catholics will never be able to come to Rome. It's too far, they can't afford it.
I am happy to be with you in Madison Square Gardens. God bless America.
We appreciate the strong symbol of freedom that you have stood for.
Catholics around the world are anxiously watching the state of their Pope's health.
In Slovakia today, a visibly weak Pope John Paul struggled to celebrate Mass.
The world's 1 billion Catholics are praying and waiting.
And a good and faithful servant of God has been called